1725 to 1761. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. Mi'kmaq treaty rights are constitutionally protected, and Mi'kmaq people still live in Mi'kma'ki. And again, just to sort of make those words meaningful to the context here, there are all kinds of issues still alive about, what do the treaty rights mean? Are they being respected and honored? And we're seeing this play out, for example, in New Brunswick with the provincial government trying to assert one interpretation that disagrees with what Mi'kmaq Maliseet people believe to be the case. And so these are live issues that we all need to be mindful, and I think it's important that we take time to reflect on what our obligations are under these treaties and not take anything for granted. So that said, I'll just introduce, as I'm sure many folks here already know, Dr. Margaret Robinson, but I'll give a formal introduction here. So Margaret will be our presenter today, and the title of the presentation, as you saw, Truth-Telling and Reconciling Identity. And so Margaret is from Esquikquak, Nova Scotia, and a member of the Lennox Island First Nation. And I'm sure Margaret can correct my pronunciation when she begins. And so Margaret has been a community-based researcher for 15 years and has led studies on decolonizing research funding in Canada, Two-Spirit people's understanding of mental health, and cannabis use among bisexual women. She is currently a co-investigator on studies of the regulation of non-medical cannabis, LGBTQ poverty and health, decolonization in Canada and Taiwanese animation, and the Atlantic Indigenous Mentorship Network. Margaret conducted her postdoctoral training at the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto and was previously a researcher in residence in Indigenous health at the Ontario HIV Treatment Network in Toronto. And so I'll let Margaret take the floor at this point, and I want to thank her personally for taking time in a very busy schedule to share her thoughts and insights and wisdom with us today. And welcome, Margaret, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Dave. Gwe, Ninjaluizi Margaret Robinson, Lewet Iskigawage, Wigi Sezakuk. Hi, I'm Dr. Margaret Robinson. I'm a Two-Spirit Mi'kmaq researcher. I'm a member of Lennox Island First Nation, as was mentioned, and I'm a status Indian. I became a status Indian in 2010 under Bill C-3. I'm what they call a 6-2, which means I'm registered under Section 6.2 of Canada's Indian Act. I'm the least amount of Indigenous you can be and be counted as an Indigenous person in Canada. So I'm a person at the edge, as it were. I work at Dalhousie University as an associate professor, and I hold the Canada Research Chair in Reconciliation, Gender, and Identity. Most of my work considers how identity and culture keep us well. And today I'll be talking about truth-telling in relation to issues of data collection and settler imposture. And then finally, I'll offer some recommendations based on the work and research that I've done.
Margaret, just when you interject, your slides aren't showing. I don't know if you intended them to be. You may have to share a screen, but.
Okay, let me.
Okay, there we go.
Wonderful. Okay. So I want my research data to tell the truth about Indigenous people and about our lives. And part of this involves using terms that Indigenous communities use to describe themselves. So I don't always know how to pronounce these terms. I do a lot of searching around on the internet to find videos where people talk about their own communities and say the words. And so I apologize sincerely if I get the words wrong. I'm not always the best with pronunciation, but I will do my best today. So I'll start with an example of Two-Spirit. Two-Spirit is a term coined in 1990 by Indigenous and sexual gender minority people, and it replaces an earlier anthropological label, which was Berdache, which anthropologists used to describe gender roles in Indigenous nations. And so part of telling the truth about Two-Spirit people is to use the term that they selected themselves, Two-Spirit, rather than, say, labeling them in my work as really lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans. And so these roles in Indigenous nations were all initially seen as distinct genders. So for example, among the Lakota, also called the Dakota or the Sioux, they use the term winkte to describe the gender of people who had been assigned male at birth, but then came to live socially as women. Among the Ashwi, people in this situation were called the Lamana. And among the Diné, often called the Navajo, they use the term nadle, which means one in a constant state of change. And so each community had a different way of expressing the truth about how that person or someone in that gender category lived in their community. And the languages will often express how people saw that sort of role in their culture. When anthropologists first wrote about these genders, they did so within the specific cultural context. So for instance, Willard Hill's 1938 work, Notes on the Pima Berdache, about the Kemel Anthwam people, they used the focus on, it was very tight. It was just looking at one particular indigenous nation and what that role was in that nation. However, with industrialization in the late 1920s, settlers started shifting from viewing indigenous nations as distinct political bodies to seeing them all as an example of a larger category, the Native American Indian. So by the 1950s, we see the label Berdache being used to describe roles that are across nations. So in 1955, a note on Berdache was written by scholars Henry Angelino and Charles L. Shedd, and they use the term the North American Berdache, which suggests that the role is similar right across the continent. Although we don't use the term Berdache today, research often makes the same assumption, that all indigenous people who express gender differently are in some way similar, that we can categorize them together and still be telling the truth. So researchers regularly use the term two-spirit to describe all the indigenous participants in our sample who report a minority sexual or gender identity. We just might group them all together as two-spirit. Now, from a settler health perspective, two-spirit might seem like a sexual identity, like queer, bisexual, lesbian, or gay. And it might seem like a gender identity, such as non-binary or trans. However, let's take settlers out of the picture for the moment and only consider indigenous nations. When we do this, I notice that two-spirit has similarities to two other roles that I've encountered. Both of these roles are spiritual, which is why they're not often engaged in a health framework. But for indigenous people, spirituality is a significant social determinant of health. So the first role I'll note is the Heyoka, sometimes translated as the contrary or the sacred clown. Heyoka comes from the Lakota and Dakota people of the plains, but the first contrary I met was Cree elder Vern Harper. He led the Toronto branch of the American Indian movement, and I met him when he was serving as the elder in residence at the Center for Addictions and Mental Health in Toronto, where I did 2 of my postdocs. I'm not two-spirit, he told me, but I'm a contrary, which is a bit similar. The contrary does things backwards or unconventionally, offering a satire that challenges social norms and boundaries. This role strikes me as similar in some ways to the settler concept of queer, yet while the contrary role might include sexuality or gender, it's not a sexual or gender role per se. It's about balancing opposites, about challenging the Unlike two-spirits, which describes roles for individuals, some sources report the Heyoka were part of societies that incorporated contrariness into dances or rituals. A second role associated with two-spirit is that of shaman, or a person who can communicate and travel to other spiritual worlds. In Mi'kmaq culture, the Buowan is often described as healing the sick or solving problems. The Native Women's Association of Canada associates the Buowan with two-spirit and trans being. And this seems to me slightly recent association. The common element I see between Buowan and two-spirit is boundary shifting. As Mi'kmaq knowledge keeper Dr. Randall Bowers and Elder Dr. Daniel Paul explained in their book, Mi'kmaq Buowanak Two-Spirit Medicine, there is a poetry in the being in the Buowanak tradition. This is often referred to as shape-shifting, being with male or female, appearing as male or female, and or taking on the spirit energy of totemic creatures, or taking on the more esoteric layers and personas of a medicine keeper, pipe carrier, healer, or seer. A recurring theme that shows up in many of the works I've read, academic works looking at Indigenous identity and Indigenous sexuality, is the lack of relevance of sexual identity for Indigenous communities. There are over 500 Indigenous nations in North America, and that's a lot of variation. However, to generalize, sexuality doesn't seem to be a marker of identity in many cases, and gender is relevant in some places and not in others. Among the Mi'kmaq, sexuality and gender do not seem to have been labeled as identities. Instead, people were described based on their abilities, such as the Buowan, or on their behavior. One might, for example, say Ginimu Gisalagi, which Two-Spirit Mi'kmaq scholar John R. Syllaboy translates as one loves men. But as Syllaboy notes, the phrase doesn't specify the gender of the person doing the loving. It lacks a sexual implication, and so Syllaboy concludes that it isn't equivalent to a sexual identity. This study by Dr. Elizabeth Sawick and colleagues found that 28.7% of the Indigenous youth in the US were not sure what their sexual orientation was, compared to only 12.2% of Anglo-American youth. Sawick and colleagues also received high rates of non-response from Indigenous youth on questions of sexual attraction or sexual fantasy. Sawick and colleagues theorized that the youth might be hesitant to reply due to cultural taboos against discussing sexuality, or that tribal norms might have a different construction of sexual identities with different meanings attached to them. Personally, I've seen plenty of instances where sexual differences recognized in an Indigenous community, but it's not always framed as especially salient. In a Mi'kmaq context, for example, what I have in common with other Mi'kmaq is often more significant than the ways that I'm different. Indigenous scholars Maggie Walter and Chris Anderson note that limitations in Indigenous research include a lack of tribally specific data, a lack of representative data, a lack of statistical power to conduct sophisticated analyses. All of these are issues for me as a Two-Spirit researcher. In their book, Indigenous Statistics, Walter and Anderson outline how colonial population management has driven our data collection, determining what questions we ask and then what we do with that data. Surveys rarely reflect Indigenous interests or worldviews. For example, we often ask if people are First Nations, Inuit, or Métis, and we might ask if they're status or non-status. But we rarely ask about categories that are more significant to Indigenous people in our nations. So I've rarely been asked in a survey, what Indigenous nation do you belong to? And been able to select Mi'kmaq. I've rarely ever been asked what community I might belong to, such as Lennox Island, or what territory I lived in, or what confederacy I was in. Some places, clan is extremely important, and we rarely ask about that. And we might ask somebody's name, but we don't often ask which family they're aligned to. So although I'm a Robinson by name, my Mi'kmaq family is Paul. Here are some questions from the Indigenous People Survey of 2022, conducted by Statistics Canada. I identify as Mi'kmaq, but that's not an option. I would have to select First Nations, someone else with my same history. So Mi'kmaq and Scottish ancestry, who grew up without status, who lived off reserve, might select Métis, meaning to indicate that their ancestry is mixed. This conflicts with the understanding of Métis held by the Métis National Council, which represents Métis communities from Ontario and further west. However, it's how many people with mixed ancestry in Quebec and further east might identify. How we identify, what it means, and who gets to choose which options are available in a survey or are legitimate at all is a serious issue. We're not just reporting reality when we do research, we're shaping it by deciding which values and identities to reinforce. The questions asked in this survey would not produce data about my own nation, because my belonging to the Mi'kmaq Nation is irrelevant to the aim of the study, which is colonial management of populations based on their history of relations with the federal government. That's why we're separating out the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So take a simple question. How many Two-Spirit people live in Mi'kmaq? In an ideal world, this would be easy to answer, but colonialism makes it very hard to answer. First off, large studies don't consider Indigenous territory. We could gather data from federally mandated reserves, perhaps, except settlers also live there, particularly those who married into the community. We could hold surveys of people who hold Indian status, except some settler women received Indian status by marrying status men. This ended in 1985 with the passing of Bill C-31. But a woman aged 56 or older today with Indian status might not have any Indigenous ancestry if her status came through marriage. Maybe we could survey enrolled members of Indigenous nations, except many Indigenous people, usually women, aren't eligible for membership. And some communities close their rolls to new members to conserve funds, leaving many Indigenous people without a home community. And then there are people with Indigenous ancestry. Some call this tribal identity. So for example, more people would identify themselves as Mi'kmaq than could establish Mi'kmaq citizenship. Some Mi'kmaq might accept them as community members. Some might not. However, our treaties don't distinguish. The Peace and Friendship Treaty of 1752, for example, applies to the settler government and to the indigenous people who signed it. And their said tribe, their heirs, and the heirs of their heirs forever. Nothing about blood quantum or identity administered and administered by the federal government. Moreover, not everyone with recent ancestry makes it an important part of their identity. So, for example, many Black Nova Scotians have Mi'kmaq ancestry, but because their Blackness shapes their life so much more than their Mi'kmaq ancestry, it might not always be seen as significant. People are less likely to identify with their Indigenous nation if they were scooped or assimilated. So we have a diaspora of Indigenous people who identify as settlers who may not know they're Indigenous, but that knowledge holds no meaning for them. Additionally, even Indigenous borders change over time. Newfoundland is part of Mi'kmaq now, but it wasn't always. So how can I count Two-Spirit people in Mi'kmaq? Could I sort by postal code, I wondered? No, as it turned out. So give you an example here. This is the area of Mi'kmaq where I was raised. It's called Wedgewig, which means the bubbling water, and it's in the district of Escagawage. The postal code is BOJ3BO, and it covers over 5,500 kilometers. It contains Reserve 36, outlined in red, which is administered by Millbrook First Nation. To complicate matters further, not all of the Mi'kmaq in our area live on or are eligible to live on this reserve land. I lived 8 minutes away, for instance. And the situation changes over time. I wasn't eligible to live on the reserve growing up, but I would be eligible today. Not everyone with Mi'kmaq ancestry in my community identified publicly as Mi'kmaq, and despite the reserve presence, the community was very much a white settler village. So I say I grew up in Wedgewig because I want to use Mi'kmaq terms, but sometimes I ask myself, is this capturing a truth? Are people going to imagine my community was more Indigenous than it really was if I say Wedgewig? Is balancing the preservation and use of Mi'kmaq language telling a falsehood to people who are trying to understand where I'm from? I worry about these things. And the question of how many Two-Spirit people there are in Mi'kmaq remains something I can't answer, which is frustrating for a Two-Spirit researcher. How can we understand Two-Spirit health and how it's shaped by culture? These are questions from the Young Mania Rating Scale, developed by Dr. Vincent Ziegler in 1978. It's used to assess bipolar disorder. But we see that terms such as inappropriate or questionable highlight the degree to which cultural and social norms and their violation are of key interest in the diagnosis. I wonder how someone using this form might perceive a heyoka or a contrary. Note also the references to being overdressed, poorly groomed, or bizarre. We can also see how cosmology comes into play in the reference to grandiose ideas or delusions, which presume that there's an agreed upon nature of reality from which a patient might deviate. Few measures reflect an Indigenous worldview or consider the cultural norms of a specific Indigenous nation. Even in a project led by Two-Spirit people, we may have to choose between measures that define some Indigenous people as mentally ill, or at best wrongly socialized. There's been a lot of news in the past 2 years about people who represented themselves as Indigenous but were not, and this is not a new phenomenon. However, there are some important changes going on in how people identify, and it's showing up in surveys. According to the 2016 census, 1.4 million people in Canada have Indigenous ancestry, or believe they do enough to tell so to the federal government. Some are correct. Lots of people have Indigenous ancestry. Some are honestly mistaken. Family stories aren't always accurate. However, some of the people who claim to be Indigenous are lying about it. A study by Statistics Canada found that 25.5% of those, so quarter pretty much, who identified as Aboriginal in 2011 had identified as non-Aboriginal in a previous survey. But change doesn't automatically mean dishonesty. Genealogical research is becoming more accessible, and some people have been influenced by DNA variant reports that suggest someone has ancestry from specific peoples. In addition, the stigma associated with being Indigenous has reduced, leading many people to embrace that aspect of themselves publicly for the first time. Successful recruitment of Indigenous and Two-Spirit people requires that we consider who we count as an Indigenous participant. It also means we need to think carefully about why we're asking these questions. Do I include everyone who reports Indigenous ancestry? Maybe not. But where would I draw the line? If I'm using a social determinants of health framework, perhaps two-spirit well-being is a social concern. So maybe I'm interested primarily in people who live in Indigenous communities, or in how living away from their community affects their well-being and their access to social support. Great. So what counts as an Indigenous community? Areas some people were forced to live by the colonial government used to be called reserves. Today, many people use the term Indigenous community, but not every Indigenous community is a formal reserve. My grandmother moved to Jabuktuk, Halifax, as a young woman, and we've had 5 generations of Robinsons living there since. A common solution has been to ask, who claims you? My family claims me. We've got lots of Robinsons in Jabuktuk. Does that make Jabuktuk an Indigenous community? Maybe not. We don't have a representative government there. If we pursue this line, we might exclude Indigenous people who live apart from others. Do the antisocial lose their right to their identities? So when asking who claims you, are we asking about social acceptance as part of the group or about political citizenship? Some people are accepted as Mi'kmaq socially and culturally, including people who were adopted in or marry in, but are not registered citizens. And some registered citizens are not considered part of the cultural or social group. There's a term for this sometimes used called paper Indians, meaning that you have the paperwork to show that you're Indigenous, but nobody knows who you are and you don't do anything in the community group. Cultural belonging, community belonging as a criterion also raises the question of which communities we consider legitimate and which we do not. In 1956, for example, Canada declared Sinix First Nation, a Salish people, to be extinct, leaving members in BC and in the US without recognition under the Indian Act. After many years of dispute, this decision was reversed in 2021 by the Supreme Court. The legitimacy of an Indigenous nation is not a decision settler governments or researchers should be making, but we do it all the time. This is an issue that Indigenous people should be making for themselves. And we don't always agree, though. My suggestion is to be transparent about who you surveyed and where they belong. Be aware of trauma. Asking for details about identity or community belonging can be re-traumatizing. And that can have health impacts. So for instance, in the Honor Project, a study of Two-Spirit wellness by Choctaw scholar Dr. Karina Walters, they found that Two-Spirit people who reflected on their historical loss more often had higher rates of smoking. If my loss included having my community declared illegitimate or my people extinct, then seemingly simple questions about my ancestry, my identity, or my citizenship could be very stressful, and it might worsen my health. As a researcher, it's important to report what you used and the reason. Show your work, as they say. Let future researchers, future readers, decide what to do with it. I urge you to consider the workings of colonialism and settler privilege in your studies. Maggie Walter and Chris Anderson note that the Canadian census is used to enumerate Aboriginal sociality in important ways, but it doesn't address 3 contexts. It doesn't address tribal specificity, so it can't tell me anything about the Mi'kmaq. It ignores the urban context where half of Indigenous people live, and it misses the complexity of the Métis national context. Walter and Anderson note that the categories in the census emerged from on-reserve colonial administrative policies that are over a century old, yet they're virtually the only evidence available, and they do shape policy. The long-standing practice naturalizes ways of understanding Indigenous peoples and our communities and the issues that affect us. Some suggest that the concept of Indigenous itself is colonial, since its only purpose is to distinguish the citizens of Indigenous nations from the citizens of a settler state living on their territories. So I'll talk briefly about some recommendations. If you're collecting Indigenous, particularly Two-Spirit data, these might be helpful. I suggest you do ask participants if they're Indigenous, but explain what this means. Many newcomers won't know. This can help you separate out settlers who might also identify as Two-Spirit, because there are some of those folks as well. Decide ahead of time whether you're intending to include Indigenous people who live in areas other than Canada and the US. If someone is Indigenous in their home country and is a newcomer to Canada, should they be checking the Indigenous box in your survey? If the answer for you is no, then ask people if they were recently a newcomer to Canada. Ask if people are two-spirit and allow them to indicate what they mean by that. In my studies, half the participants reported two-spirit as their gender, and half reported it as their sexual identity. And as we saw with Saywick, not everyone is going to consider sexual or gender identity to be meaningful for them. Since many Indigenous languages are verb-based, consider using verb-based language in your surveys, such as, are you a person who combines more than one gender? Rather than identity-based language, such as, are you two-spirit? If you're doing health research, ask if people have status, since this does determine their access to a range of services and stressors affecting health. You might consider asking when people obtain status. Someone who lived their life with status may have different health outcomes than someone who obtained status in 1985 under Bill C-31 or in 2010 under Bill C-3. Ask about territory and whether participants live in theirs. Know about the culture and the traditions of the nation from which participants come to measure factors affecting their mental health. Has their community had a boil water advisory for 40 plus years? Have they been involved in a land claim? Do they control their own social services? These factors are social, but they affect health. Measures of health that ask participants to report their health on a scale from poor to excellent may not work well with participants from gratitude-focused cultures. Most report good mental health, even if they're struggling with multiple health conditions. Consider the social practices of the participants in their cultural context, as anthropologists originally did. Family separation, for instance, is generally correlated with poor mental health. We can see the negative impact of scooping in Indian residential schools and the stigma of being different from their peers. A measure might start by asking if participants were raised by their parents. Except some nations consider it traditional for grandparents to raise the first child while parents establish themselves economically and set up a household. Are we measuring variation from the traditional norm, or are we using a settler definition of family as our standard? To decolonize research, researchers must consider how colonial perspectives shape our recruitment and our analysis. And then finally, expect everything you know to change. Indigenous nations are living nations, and their cultures are not frozen in time. So be open to having the context change over the course of your research career. I'll stop here and say Walaliuk to all of you. Thank you for your time and patience. And I'm open to questions about this or anything else that might be on your mind today. Thanks.
Wow, wonderful. On behalf of